Hi everyone, I'm Julian Togelius and I'm a professor here at NYU. So it's my honor to share this thesis defense of Graham Todd right next to me, so my PhD student for 5 years now. With me I have, in order I see them on the screen, Todd Gurekis, also at NYU, Brandon Lake of Princeton, and Josh Tannenbaum of MIT. They're all attending remotely. The order of the day will be that Graham will give a 45-minute talk, which will be recorded and which will be followed by questions from the audience. And after that, there will be a closed session. Those of you here, you can wait down in the Game Innovation Lab during the committee poses question to Graham. It's like it's you, your name, right? And yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be great. Take it away, Graham.
All right, thank you. Just got to get the slides set up here. Okay, are the slides visible to the folks on Zoom? Great. Okay. Well, I suppose we'll get started. Thank you again, everyone, very much for coming here to my thesis defense. My thesis is entitled Games, Goals, Programs, Modeling and Understanding the Process of Game Creation in Humans and Machines. All right, so I am a member of the Game Innovation Lab, which means in large part that I study games. And why are games interesting to study? Well, in large part, it's because games act as learnable simulations of the world. They model sort of particular parts of the world abstractly in a way that we can interact with, but then they sort of elide over other details of the world in a way that makes them tractable to learn and to enjoy. As part of this, games also test various different cognitive capacities. So, for instance, a game might task you with planning multiple steps into the future, or with exploring a new and unfamiliar environment, or perhaps with inferring the mental states of other players or non-player characters in the game. So in light of all these cognitive capacities that games require from us, they have often been used. I'm realizing that my titles cannot be seen here. There we go. Just moving that over there. All right. Games have often been used as lenses through which to understand the mind. So chess has been used to study cognition for a long time. Here's tracking the eye movements of chess masters. Children's strategy learning has been examined and modeled in the game of tic-tac-toe. And in adults, how they develop expertise in abstract strategy games and other sorts of tasks has been modeled using the game of 4 in a row. And analogously, games are also useful lenses through which to understand computational or artificial minds. So indeed, many of the most recognizable achievements in the field of artificial intelligence have come in the form of game-playing agents, whether that's Deep Blue defeating Garry Kasparov in chess, AlphaGo defeating Lee Sedol in Go, or perhaps more esoterically, the Cicero system defeating human players in the game of diplomacy. So we have games that are both lenses on the world and on the mind. And sort of in summary, games are in large part interesting because they demand all these different things from us: perception, planning, and memory, and this makes them interesting targets to study. But what we're sort of interested in this thesis is the kind of problems surrounding this. How do you actually come up with the kinds of games that are worth playing, worth thinking about, and worth studying in the first place? So this sort of outer head is what we're interested in getting inside. Now, this is obviously the domain of professional game designers, people who make games for a living, but I'll contend also that this problem of game creation is something that all of us tend to engage in at different points in our lives. So obviously children are sort of famous for their ability to invent new things to do, new games to play out of everyday materials in their world. But you could also think of the systems of rules and regulations that we design to organize our societies as having a certain game-like structure. And even science itself can be thought of as a game against nature, where we make certain kinds of moves, like double-blind studies or doctoral theses. These can all sort of be unified under this framing of the rational pursuit of unnecessary goals. So the goals themselves might not be instrumentally important to our survival, but while we're pursuing them, we're doing so sort of buying into the magic circle, the rules of the game themselves. And I think that extends beyond just what we might think of as professional game design. So we're interested in studying how people can come up with games like this. In short, how do people flexibly invent new and interesting games and goals, and how can we start to replicate that process computationally? Now, there's a few different motivations for tackling this question. One is cognitive. So by doing this, we gain a better understanding of human adaptation to novel tasks and creativity, the ability to invent new tasks. There's a more computational motivation, which is to design artificial systems that can set new tasks for themselves and self-improve, sort of develop more expertise as they go. And then there's a third final sort of cultural motivation, I'll say, which is just to understand games themselves. I think games are worthy objects of study, in part because of their role as cultural artifacts that sort of transcend the barriers of both time and culture around the world. So these are our three motivations. And to start to go into more of the technical problem here, what we're interested in doing is sort of searching over the space of possible games, which we're going to represent using rules, the rules of the game. But there's a question, which is, how are we actually going to manifest and represent those rules? So one sort of natural approach would be to represent them in plain language, natural language. That's how we tend to communicate rules to each other. In this work, however, we're going to take the approach of representing games as programs. So this is a program in what's called a domain-specific language, a sort of specialized programming language for the game of Reversi. Here's the natural language rules as well. And there are a few benefits to representing games as programs. One of them is sort of clarity. By representing things in a particular syntax, a particular grammar, we can be really precise about what the different rules are, where they might be somewhat vague in natural language. And the other sort of primary benefit is that programs are executable. We can run them. We can ask questions about their behavior, about what it looks like to simulate playing them. So throughout this thesis, we'll be representing games and playful goals as programs, often in these domain-specific languages. The problem that we're then trying to do can sort of concisely be described as program synthesis. We're trying to find new programs that meet some kind of criteria. In this case, program synthesis is the same as game synthesis because of this mapping between games and programs. So you can imagine that there's some sort of landscape of possible programs, and there's some value that can sort of distinguish between them, what we might call a fitness value. This could be any number of things. It could be some notion of how fun a game is, how challenging it is, how balanced, how human-like. But basically, you can imagine that there's these games sort of distributed over this landscape. Some of them are better, here's colored more yellow than others, and we're trying to find these high quality, these yellow programs. And one sort of common computational approach that we'll use throughout this thesis is evolutionary search. So this is a class of algorithms that are broadly inspired by the biological process of evolution that basically maintain a population of multiple programs at once that might differ in how fit they are. Here, the color, which is a little washed out. And over time, we're hoping to select the programs that are doing slightly better than the others, mutate them, and hopefully wind up with new programs and iteratively kind of refine them at this population level, one step at a time, hopefully eventually winding up with programs that are high up in this fitness landscape that we described earlier. So that's the sort of technical overview of the work here. Going more specifically into the projects, Julian, do you mind handling the admits? There's a number of different projects here that are sort of separated based on whether they're primarily motivated by this cognitive approach or the computational approach. In the cognitive camp, we have work that is modeling the process of human goal creation as the synthesis of reward-producing programs. We also have a project on understanding goals in open-ended games. And finally, one about inferring the goals of other agents in these playful domains. On the computational side, we have work that is designing a novel evolutionary algorithm for designing new abstract strategy board games using evolutionary search and language models, as well as the design of a particular domain-specific language that takes advantage of recent advances in modern parallel processing hardware. And then finally, we will conclude with a project that sort of begins to tie these threads together, a process-level account of human game creation among novice game designers that takes advantage of some of these recent improvements on the computational side. So with that said, I should also mention sort of surrounding all these motivations, again, is this cultural motivation, the desire to understand games as games as well. All right, so now with that out of the way, we can get started with the first of the projects here, which is goals as reward-producing programs. So here our primary question is, how can we better capture the richness of human goals in playful contexts and also in general, as well as the flexibility with which people can create these new goals? This was work done in collaboration with a number of wonderful people, Guy Davidson, as well as members of my committee, Brendan Lake, Todd Garekis, and of course my advisor, Julian Togalius. I will highlight Guy, who will appear multiple times throughout this thesis as an excellent collaborator throughout the many years of this thesis. So here, the domain that we're studying is a sort of room full of balls, blocks, bins, and toys, what you might imagine as like a children's toy room. And we're interested in modeling the kinds of games that people come up with in these sorts of domains. So Guy actually collected this very great data set by having people play around in this 3D physics engine and then soliciting from them goals that were in some sense scoreable, where we could obtain an objective measure of quality from them. And people produce a large variety of different goals that take advantage of the structure of the room. For instance, they might be throwing the ball into the bin, but then there's also these goals that are sort of more spread out in time. Things like throwing the ball so that it bounces off of the wall and then lands in the bin at last, or something that requires setting up the scene first before the game can be played, like placing the bin on the bed. So we have this data set of goals that people created, and then Guy also translated all of these into a program. So this is a sort of pseudocode for a domain-specific language that's sort of capturing the semantics of each of these goals. And again, I'll just highlight that one of the benefits of this programmatic representation is that we can sort of ask objective questions about these programs that might be harder to read just off of the natural language descriptions. We can sort of detect certain motifs in the programmatic representation, certain kinds of mechanics that are being used, as well as the complexity and the length of the goals in a way that sort of normalizes over all the different ways that you might describe it in natural language. So we have this big data set of goals represented as programs from which we can extract all these features. And our goal now is to try to come up with a generative model that can produce more goals like this, more human-like goals in this setting. We do this in a two-stage process. So I mentioned that we want to create human-like goals, but it's not at first clear what it means for a goal to be human-like, or how to write down a function that will tell you how human-like a goal is. And our approach here was to learn this from the data that we had. So this is a technique called contrastive learning. The short of it is basically that we take our data set of goals that people made and we corrupt them. We sort of delete sections of them and fill them back in almost randomly. And that gives us this big data set of both human-created goals and goals that we're quite confident are worse, less human-like, more random, less interpretable than those human-like goals. And then we learn a function which sort of pulls these pools of games apart. It gives high scores to the games that people made and low scores to all these corruptions. And we use this as our sort of proxy measure of human-likeness, of how human-like a goal is. With this fitness function in hand, we can now perform the evolutionary search that I mentioned before. This is a particular kind of evolutionary algorithm called map-elites, which is a quality diversity algorithm, where we're trying to find not just one really good, really human-like program, but a whole range of human-like programs that differ along some sort of behavioral axes. So effectively, we're maintaining an archive of games at any given time that start off very bad, not very human-like at all, and we're going to iteratively pick one of them, mutate it somehow, modify it, mix it up with another one of the games in the archive, etc. And then we're going to evaluate it using this fitness function and put it back into the archive if it's either somewhere new, somewhere that we haven't been before in the space of games, or if it's better than something that we've already seen in a region that we've already encountered. So we run this procedure iteratively for many, many generations, and just at a quantitative level, the model is quite successful in optimizing this fitness function and filling out the archive of games. We can see that the archive occupancy fills up very quickly, and that the range of fitness values that the model obtains are within the bounds of the actual human-created games under this learned fitness function. One sort of important point here is because of how the archive is set up, we can actually distinguish between two kinds of model-created games. Those that wind up in the same region of game space as a human-created game, and those that are sort of further afield. So we call the ones that end up in the same cell of the archive as a real human game a matched model game, and those that are in unoccupied cells that weren't part of the human data set, unmatched games. And we have this sort of quantitative evidence But we're both interested in sort of qualitatively examining these goals and then also really trying to understand whether or not these goals were human-like, since all we have right now is the evidence of this learned fitness function. So just sort of qualitatively, a participant game might be something like throwing a ball so it touches a wall, and then you either catch it or it bounces off of you ultimately. In the same cell, we have a model-generated game, which is semantically related. It's a game about throwing dodgeballs, but here the objective is to have dodgeballs so that they land or stop moving on top of a shelf, and you have 30 seconds to do this as many times as you can. So I'll just point out here that a matched game and the corresponding human game aren't necessarily very similar to each other. I have a slide where I can go into more detail about this, but they're not just sort of duplicating the existing human games. They sort of, at a high level, match them in semantic properties, but they are meaningfully distinct. The unmatched games, by contrast, are also given high fitness scores, but they, even from a sort of qualitative inspection, seem a little further afield. This is a game about throwing dodgeballs and putting credit cards or CDs into a hexagonal bin. Not immediately clear how those things fit together. And so we also ran this additional study where we had people evaluate these goals. A new set of participants were presented with these goals, translated back into natural language, and then we asked them to rate them on these 7-point scales across a variety of metrics: how understandable, how fun would it be to play it, how fun would it be to watch it, how much would attempting this goal teach you about the environment, how difficult would it be, how creative, and how human-like. There's a lot of numbers here, but the important thing is to look at the difference between the real human-created games and then the matched games. And what we basically see is that there aren't any significant differences in between the real games and the matched model-created games over these ratings. Where we do see these significant differences between the real and the unmatched and the matched and the unmatched games. So sort of taken together, this is giving us positive indication that these games are meaningfully human-like, that we've sort of succeeded in this generative process of creating human-like games. And again, we also have sort of separate evidence that they're not just duplicating the human games, they're meaningfully distinct as well. So sort of in summary, framing human goals as programs allows us to capture more of their rich temporal and compositional structure in the tasks that people set for themselves. So a lot of these goals that people gave to us are sort of naturally expressible as programs. By searching automatically through the space of program, we can indeed generate human-like goals that are rated very similarly to the real goals that participants create. And also sort of alluding to this other computational motivation, these human-like goals and the procedure for generating them could be useful for training artificial agents that are sort of similarly able to set new tasks for themselves and go out and accomplish them. So that brings us to the end of this section and on to the next of the largely cognitively inspired works, which is about understanding goals in open-ended games. So here our primary question is basically seeing how we can use this programmatic representation of goals that we've developed in the previous work and bring that into a more sort of open-ended space using a real game out in the world that people play to kind of further enrich our study of goals. Now, this was work that was done in collaboration with Junyi Chu, Guy Davidson again, who I notice just joined, so I'll repeat my compliments to Guy of being a wonderful collaborator throughout much of this work. Actually, maybe that was him just joining now. Anyway, also Weijia Zhu at Microsoft Research, where I did an internship over the summer. So here, our target domain is the game of Minecraft. So Minecraft is a 3D open-ended exploration game where players are put into this randomly generated world made out of different kinds of cubes, and they go around interacting with different entities like sheep or zombies or spiders, and harvesting different kinds of blocks, combining those blocks into different items and building their own structures. And one of the kind of notable things about Minecraft as a domain is that it's very open-ended. There's not a lot of top-down direction from the game itself as to what you ought to be doing, and so players wind up setting goals for themselves. They might be something relatively straightforward, like mining diamonds, to something perhaps a bit more involved, like building a castle, all the way up to quite complicated automated structures that are automating the process of obtaining a resource, or challenges for themselves, like defeating 5 zombies without getting hit by them a single time. And so we're interested in using Minecraft as another domain in which to study how people set goals for themselves and also evaluate the goals of other people. So one of the benefits of using Minecraft as a domain is that people sort of naturally vary in how familiar they are with the domain. This is a game that many people have played quite extensively. And compared to some other experimental paradigms where we're creating the environment ourselves, people are coming into this experiment with their own familiarity with the domain. So as part of the internship, I also ran an experiment where we solicited these sort of short-term playful goals from people in Minecraft after introducing them to the rules of the game. And what we're showing here is a sort of high-level semantic breakdown of the categories of the goals people created based on whether or not they were novices to the game of Minecraft or at least somewhat experienced in it. And the kind of point that I'll highlight here is just that there are large differences. These are statistically significantly different distributions over these categories. And we see that the novice game goal creators, are much more likely to create goals that are about crafting or obtaining an item, which is one of Minecraft's mechanics that's very rule-based. There's a particular recipe that you follow in order to obtain an item, whereas experienced creators are much more likely to create goals about building new structures, which is a much more sort of open-ended and there's no sort of direct, prescribed, correct way to accomplish these goals. But largely, however, the point that I want to raise here is just that games like Minecraft give us this new feature that we can use to start to pull apart how people are thinking about goals. We've shown that there are these differences here. Once again, however, we're continuing with the programmatic theme. So I also designed a domain-specific language that actually interfaces with the game of Minecraft in order to represent a lot of these temporally extended goals, like killing zombies without being hit or jumping between different trees while the trees are on fire. And we also performed, again, another rating study where we asked people to evaluate these kinds of goals that people made, again, across a variety of domains. And we had a few different hypotheses about what would be important to this rating procedure. So we had three hypotheses that were largely surrounding different kinds of features of the goals and of the people doing the task. So one, we think that familiarity with the domain ought to play a role in how people are evaluating the goals of other people. We also have theories about the concreteness of that goal, so whether or not it is one of these prescribed goals with certain rigid rules about how it can be accomplished, or if it's more open-ended. And then also the complexity of the goal, which is something where we can use, again, our programmatic representation to start to analyze complexity at a sort of lens that doesn't depend on natural language. So we hypothesize that all of these are influencing how people rate goals. Sort of more concretely, in terms of familiarity, we might ask how experienced is the goal creator or the rater with Minecraft. And another benefit of using Minecraft here as a domain is that there's a lot of extant discussion, for instance, online about Minecraft. And so we're able to use the corpus of Reddit discussions on the Minecraft subreddit and measure how close are the goals that people propose to the kinds of topics that people are discussing on Reddit. In terms of concreteness, we can ask whether the goal is using Minecraft's fixed or open-ended game mechanics. And we can also use the programmatic representation to kind of get at this question of concreteness, because not every goal can be represented as a program. In fact, in Minecraft, one of the things that's very challenging and that we don't represent as programs are these building-based goals, because there isn't a way to sort of deterministically say, congrats, you have completed a castle. And so we don't code all of the goals, and we can use that itself as a feature. And then finally, complexity-wise, we can ask how complicated is this goal linguistically in natural language, and then also how complicated is it when translated into our program representation. Albeit at a sort of high level here, we ran a bunch of these mixed effects models using different collections of features. Some of them were more explanatory than others. But sort of ultimately, we do find evidence for each of these hypotheses sort of in isolation. I've highlighted some of the sort of most influential features that we found across these different mixed effects models. The subreddit discussion feature is particularly predictive, the fixed and open-ended mechanics as well as whether the goal can be, in fact, represented at all in our programmatic lens. So in summary, games like Minecraft allow us to extend this study of playful goals in new ways by combining this open-endedness, this lack of a top-down direction, with still the benefit of having an actual game simulator that we can ask empirical questions about very rigidly. Using existing games also gives us access to these new features, such as domain familiarity, and to take advantage of extant corpuses of text for our analyses. And our programmatic lens, we've shown, can be extended to this richer domain, this open-ended domain of Minecraft. But we also acknowledge this caveat here that it can't represent all of the goals that someone might want to set for themselves in a game like Minecraft. So that brings us now to our third project, which is about inferring the goals of other agents. So here our question is, again, making use of this programmatic representation of goals, how can we start to capture the ways that people reason through the goals of other people that they're looking at? So this was part of a large-scale collaboration, again, with Guy Davidson and Junyi Chu, along with Cedric Colas, and then members of my committee, Josh Tenenbaum, Brendan Lake, Todd Garekis, and Julian Togelius. So here our domain is a sort of physics-based game that is largely inspired by games like Angry Birds. Players can launch this blue ball in whatever angle they want and with a different amount of strength, and it will bounce off of things. It'll get pulled by the conveyors, it'll bounce off trampolines, fall through portals, get pushed around by magnets, et cetera, et cetera. And once again, we're asking people to come up with goals that they could accomplish in this level, specifically scoreable goals where there's some notion of doing well or doing poorly. So we ask people to create these goals, and once again, we translate them into a programmatic representation. I'll highlight just one aspect of this domain, which is that we're deliberately sort of simplifying the action space. There's really only one decision that a player makes, which is where are you going to shoot the ball and how strong are you going to shoot the ball, because that makes this problem of inferring what someone is trying to do based on observing their actions a bit more tractable. So here, again, we have our data set of goals that people created along with their translation into the programmatic representation. And then in addition, we have demonstrations of those goals. So people give us actions where they are attempting to accomplish their goal. And you can think of the problem in a sort of mini version as, given these demonstrations, say you saw someone do all these actions here, which of these goals do you think that they're likely to be pursuing as they were taking these actions? We actually wind up studying this in a slightly more open-ended way, where we're not just choosing between a fixed number of goals, but we're trying to sort of synthesize from scratch the program that represents the goal that the person is pursuing. But this is also a sort of representative example. And an important part of doing this goal inference procedure is having some sense of what a person is likely to do given a goal. So what's called their goal-conditioned policy. Here, again, we're taking advantage of the fact that we have a programmatic representation that has the ability to assign a score value to different actions. So this is sort of showing, if you manage to get the ball over the conveyor belts, you get 5 points. If it ends up in the bin, you get 10 points. But if you ever touch the portal, you lose 5 points. And over on the right here, what we're looking at is what's called a Q table. It's showing, for all the different angles that someone could shoot, that's the angle on the plot, and then the radius is showing how powerfully they're shooting it, how many points does that shot wind up getting. And our assumption basically is that people are going to largely be taking actions that correspond to the red regions of this plot. Those would be high scoring shots, and they're not very likely to take the ones that are from the dark blue regions. In this particular experiment, we are not using the demonstrations that the participants provided for us, in part because they're often quite noisy or unsuccessful, and rather we're sort of assuming a slightly more idealized case where we're actually going to sample demonstrations from this plot. So we imagine that someone was picking their actions corresponding to this plot, and we get a bunch of these different actions that are distributed across this plot, and then we're trying to work backwards to try to figure out what program they were following. So again, yes, these different scoring values sort of correspond to the different regions. So again, right, we have all these different Q tables now, and again, we're trying to work backwards to find the programs. How are we going to do this? Well, once again, we're going to turn to this evolutionary optimization procedure. So we're going to maintain a population of these different possible goals that differ based on how likely those demonstrations are given that program. So that's a little technical, but the idea is we're proposing a new program. That program corresponds exactly to one of these Q tables, and then we already have this set of demonstrations. So we watch someone take all these actions, and now we can say, okay, given that we know they took these actions, how likely would it be that they took those actions if they were pursuing this goal? And the more likely that those actions are, the higher fitness we assign to that program, under the assumption that the program where those demonstrations are the most likely is precisely the program that they were actually following. So we're going to do this evolutionary search where we use this likelihood function as our fitness function, and we're going to use a code language model to mutate these programs over time to try to find one that's a good match. So here are the results for a variety of the different levels that we have. What we're looking at here is, on the left, this is saying over all the possible actions someone could take, you can assign them all a likelihood, and you can say, how different is the likelihood that the real program assigns all these actions from the likelihood that the program that we found using evolution is? That's the kind of divergence between those policies at the aggregate level. And with one notable exception for this diagonal full level, many of the results here are very low KL divergence. So they're sort of quite good behavioral matches in aggregate. But if we zoom in a little bit and we look just at the 100 most likely actions and say what percentage of those most likely actions are shared between the real program and the found program, there's a lot greater difference. So it seems like this procedure is succeeding in finding sort of behaviorally similar goals, but that they might differ kind of at the micro level, at the fine level. So partly to try to interrogate this a bit more, we also compared to an approach that sort of directly synthesizes using a language model instead of evolution, but it's a different problem because we're giving this language model access to a lot more information. Instead of just saying, here's how likely the demonstrations were under the program that you just proposed, we're going to take a much smaller set of demonstrations that sort of span all the possible scoring values, and we're going to report not just the kind of final result, but also all of the intermediate things that happen during these demonstrations. So this would be kind of akin to like watching someone throw the ball and noticing that it bounced off of the wall and then hit the conveyor and then finally went to the bin. And then again, we're just asking the language model, can you synthesize the program that seems to have generated these observations? Now this is, again, I want to emphasize this as a different problem. It's not exactly the same. And again, this sort of points to the two different sort of motivations between the cognitive and the computational. This is not a particularly powerful cognitive account of what people are doing, but it is a way for us to sort of validate the utility of the programmatic lens, and also perhaps from a computational lens to have a system that is capable of doing this goal inference more proficiently. And indeed, that is kind of what we see. This direct synthesis approach that takes advantage of this trajectory level information is broadly more successful. It maintains this very low KL divergence. It lowers it, in fact, compared to the evolutionary synthesis. And in general, it is more successful at finding actually perfect matches, very behaviorally equivalent programs. It does so much better than the evolutionary approach. So about half of the time, it's able to create a perfect match to the goal program. Just taking a look at some of the programs that these two approaches synthesize. So the target here is a program where you're trying to destroy boxes and you're trying to avoid having the ball wind up in the vanisher. The evolutionary synthesis approach finds a program that has both of those components. It cares about the boxes being destroyed and it cares about avoiding the vanisher, but it also has these sort of spurious, these unnecessary components as well, which penalize it not so much at the aggregate level, but quite a lot at the low fine level. Whereas the LLM, direct LLM synthesis, succeeds basically in fully mirroring the target program. So in conclusion, we have shown that the programmatic lens can again be leveraged to perform goal inference over this very open-ended space of goals. There's a lot of different programs someone could be following. However, without a sort of guiding prior of human likeness, just optimizing this likelihood using evolution, it does seem that we can find behavioral matches that still differ at the fine level. In addition, though, we can one of the benefits of this programmatic representation is that it exposes this trajectory level information. These low-level building blocks that the programs are made up of allow us to do this sort of trajectory level inference that seems to be more successful. And so an interesting direction for future work is trying to kind of combine this iterative inference procedure with this trajectory level information. All right, so that takes us out of the primarily cognitively inspired works and into the computationally inspired works. The first of which is an evolutionary algorithm for designing novel board games. Here our question is, how can we start to replicate this human capacity for inventing new and interesting games? Whoops, sorry. This was work done in collaboration with Alexander Padula, Dennis Summers, Matthew Stevenson, Eric Piet, my advisor Julian Togalius. Special shout out to Alex and Dennis, who have been with me for many years across many projects, and who I wouldn't have been able to do this without. So here, again, our objective is to generate new and interesting board game rule sets. And we're going to be taking advantage, once again, of a programmatic representation, specifically the domain-specific language Ludi, which here is showing, again, the description of the game Reversi, translated into this program, again, with this mapping from the natural language components into the blocks of the program. And we're again doing a sort of two-stage procedure here for trying to find new and interesting games. like our first project. However, we're not here trying to learn a fitness function from data. I will talk about the fitness function in a moment. Rather, what we're learning from this big data set is a operator that can sort of intelligently mutate games, so that we're not just doing that randomly, but hopefully doing so in a way that's likely to wind up with more plausible and interesting games. So one of the benefits of Ludi is that it is also a large data set of more than 1,200 games from around the world, different eras of time. And so we can take advantage of this data set to train a language model that basically learns to do what's called infilling. So you can imagine that we have this program and we delete part of it, and then we ask the language model to put back in what was deleted. And we train it to do this very well across a bunch of different games and different amounts of context. And then we use a set of games that the language model has never seen to initialize the search. And again, we're going to be asking it to delete parts and then fill them back in. But because it's never seen these games before, it can't perfectly fill them back in. It'll change them when it does that, but hopefully it will change them in a way that sort of winds up bringing them into a new interesting region of space. So that allows us, again, to do this evolutionary search. Again, this quality diversity algorithm, where we are going to select a game from our archive, mutate it with this learned mutation operator, and then evaluate it before adding it back into our collection of possible games. Here is the fitness function that I promised you. On the right is the sort of simple description of what's going on. It's a 3-stage process. So we have this new game. We want to know, how interesting is it? What we're trying to accomplish here is to try to get a sort of set of necessary criteria, sort of minimal criteria that we think all fun games of this class, all interesting games of this class will exhibit, but it's surely not sufficient. There are going to be lots of games that this function says are quite high scored that are probably not that interesting. Nevertheless, the procedure here is to first just determine whether the game can be compiled under our grammar and whether you can play it. Then we're going to sort of screen out initially a population of games by having random players play against each other. One of the benefits of it being a program is that we can instantiate it as a playable artifact and have simulated players duke it out. And so if between players who are just acting randomly, one player has a big advantage, then we say, okay, this game's probably not very good, and we toss it. And then finally, if it passes both of these checks, we have agents that can sort of think a bit more about their moves, play against each other, and we extract a few heuristics from this. How balanced is the game? How unlikely is it to end in a draw? How much of the board actually gets used? And also this sort of proxy for strategic depth, where we ask, how badly does an agent which moves randomly lose to an agent that can actually think? We say, the worse it loses, the better the game. So we kind of aggregate all of these scores into our fitness function, and then we can use that to run our evolutionary search. And as before, just sort of quantitatively, we do find that this is successfully able to fill the archive with potentially interesting games. What I'm highlighting here, again, sort of analogous to the unmatched games, are the games that are in cells of the archive where there isn't a corresponding game in the Ludi data set. And this approach, Gavel, that we call it, does a lot better than a variety of baselines in finding these potentially interesting games. And so we also had a Ludi expert sort of look at some of the highest fitness games to try to see if any of them would actually be potentially fun for human players. And there were a few that were turned up that seemed like they could be potentially interesting. This here is a variant of a game called Yavalath, which is a game where you're trying to form a line of pieces, a line of 5 pieces, without making a line of 4 pieces first. So you have to kind of join it up from 2 smaller sections of line. But it also incorporates the sort of surround and capture mechanics of Go. And sort of watching artificial agents play against each other, we can see some potentially interesting strategic behavior where they can set up forks and a sort of forced checkmate in 3 situation between these artificial players. So this is sort of qualitatively some evidence that this procedure is able to kind of intelligently recombine mechanics. It's not inventing something wholly new, but it is able to sort of merge mechanics from disparate games in a way that sort of passes all these automated checks and is potentially interesting. So sort of summarizing here, by leveraging this learned mutation operator, we can start to intelligently combine these game mechanics to find hopefully interesting and definitely novel games. Again, representing game rules as programs allows us to automatically evaluate these potential games and to characterize not just their descriptions, but their dynamics, how they actually play. Nevertheless, capturing the full depth of what people have in their head when they think a game is interesting or worth playing remains an open challenge, something that we're hoping to continue working on in the future. All right, that brings us to our next work here, where I'll be a little more brief. This is a domain-specific language for board games that leverages advances in modern computing hardware. It's called LUDAX. Here our question is just how can we combine all of these benefits of game description languages that I've been harping on about this whole time with the sort of blazing speed of modern hardware. This was work done, again, in collaboration with Alex and Dennis, as well as my lab mate Sam, and my advisor Julian, of course. So here is, again, the example of the game Reversi. Here on the left is Ludi, and here on the right is Ludax. The thing to take away here is that Ludax is a very ludemic. It resembles Ludi a lot in its syntax, although it modifies it a little bit. But the way that this kind of works is that you can imagine an expression. For instance, this is saying it's checking whether or not it's the second player's turn, and they've either made a line of 4 pieces or they've made a diagonal line of 3 pieces. And sort of under the hood, this is going to get converted into code in this Python library called JAX, which is what enables us to run these games in parallel on modern graphics processing hardware. These can then sort of get combined together, these JAX functions, to form higher level operators until eventually this parser will return to the user these functions that allow you to actually play the game. Do things like initialize the board, compute what are the legal actions, and perform those actions themselves. The details here are not super important, but the game description language is able to express a pretty wide variety of games, from the very simple and tic-tac-toe up to the relatively complex, like checkers with its forced captures and double moves and promotions, etc. And then, of course, it is also very, very fast. So this is showing on the x-axis the number of games that you're running at the same time, and then the y-axis the sort of total number of moves per second that you're getting across all of these simultaneous games. And basically, on a reasonable modern piece of hardware, you can often get tens of millions of moves per second. The benefits here, hopefully, is that you can start to train algorithms much faster in these environments without actually having to write any new code in this sort of very finicky JAX library. So yes, indeed, using JAX, we can combine the benefits of this formal description language with these benefits of massive parallelization on modern hardware. These gains in speed can hopefully allow us to unlock new ways of evaluating games. For instance, if we can train an agent from being a novice to being an expert in a reasonable amount of time on a game that we've just proposed, we can ask questions about the learning curve of the game. It's often said that a good game is easy to learn and hard to master, but that's hard to measure unless you have the ability to quickly model the process of learning. So hopefully LUDAX can enable some of that kind of research. And also, in general, designers and practitioners can now test their algorithms that they want to train games on a bunch of different environments without having to write more of this finicky, low-level hardware code. Okay, that brings us now to the final work here, which, as I said, starts to sort of tie some of these threads together from the cognitive and the computational side. This is a work on modeling novice game invention. Our primary question here is how we can use the tools that we've developed throughout this thesis to start analyzing the underlying process of human game creation. So what's actually going on in people's heads. This is part of a large-scale collaboration with Katie Collins, Sed Zhang, Junyi Chu, Leo Wang, Adrian Weller, Tom Griffiths, Josh Tenenbaum, and Julian Togelius. And I'll highlight Katie, who co-led this work with me and has also been a wonderful collaborator throughout a number of projects. So here, our motivation is in part this recent empirical work, which I was involved with, that has demonstrated that novice game players, people who are thinking about games for the first time, are sort of well modeled by a system that only looks a very limited amount of time into the future, just one move ahead, and then uses a few simple heuristics to try to judge how good a possible move is. This intuitive gamer model is quite good at measuring how novices act in these sort of abstract strategy games. And the reason that that's important is that when you are thinking of a potential game that you might want to create, you are inherently in the position of a novice. You haven't played the game yet. You don't have the benefit of experience. And so hopefully we can leverage this model of novice player behavior to sort of start to get at this process of game invention. Again, here we're interested in this person on the left and trying to get in actually to that process of game invention. So here we ran an experiment where, as part of this prior empirical work, people evaluated a bunch of different, basically, variants of tic-tac-toe that differed, for instance, in how the size of the board, the wind dynamics, like what different players can do to win, how they take turns, how the game ends, etc. And they were asked to evaluate how fun is this game or how fair is this game. And then at the end, they were tasked with coming up with their own new fun game. So we have these participant-created games that then, once again, we translate into a formal representation, specifically LUDAX, the game description language that I mentioned previously. And then our kind of question here is whether the games that people create are sort of best described by a model that just considers the context, like the specific games that the people saw, or that also incorporates actually some aspect of mental simulation, of actually running these intuitive gamer agents against each other and using that to try to evaluate games. So we're proposing a model that does both, that has a role for context and a role for simulation. The kinds of games that people created are quite diverse. They range from just sort of simple variants of tic-tac-toe up to onomatopoetic games where you have to yell floofy, games where you're losing lives. And again, not all of these can be expressed in our programmatic representation. So while the programmatic lens is powerful, it's not sort of omnipotent. But first, we're just looking at the effects of context. So trying to see, are people responsive to the kind of local games that they've just seen as part of this previous study? And the result that I'll highlight here is showing that they really are. So here we're looking at for different game mechanics, the sort of prevalence of that mechanic in the games that people created, based on whether or not they saw that mechanic in the set of games that they were tasked with evaluating. And so what we see here is that there is this big disparity. People were much more likely to create a game in which a player could make multiple moves at once if they saw such a game in the evaluation part of the experiment. But at the same time, it was not zero among the people who didn't see this mechanic. So people are responsive to context, but they're also capable of going beyond it by leveraging language, by leveraging simulation, by leveraging other pieces of knowledge that they might be integrating. Then in terms of the role of simulation, what we're comparing here is sort of two scores. One is just using a language model, again, over this programmatic representation, we can say, how likely is the game that the person made given the context of the games that they saw? And then what we're seeing here is we're looking at random games that were sampled from the space of all possible games, games that were used to familiarize the participants that they saw and evaluated, and then also the games that people made. And here there's not really much of a difference. These distributions are quite similar to each other, just under this likelihood-based score. But when we move to this simulation-based score, where we actually are having these intuitive gamer agents play against each other, and then we can pull out, sort of similar to the gavel work, a set of heuristics that we're trying to combine into a measure of funness, there, these distributions really do start to get pulled apart. We have some more statistical results that indicate that even sort of accounting for the additional parameter of adding the simulation-based score, it's still a better descriptor of the games that people created. So in conclusion here, the games that people create are better explained by a model that incorporates this explicit mental simulation. So we're starting to get towards these hypotheses about what's the process of game creation and whether it involves this kind of mental simulation. The exact form of that mental simulation here, we're just using the intuitive gamer model, but there's actually a lot of interesting ongoing work, which I'm happy to talk about the particular kinds of cognition that people might be deploying as part of this mental simulation. And also an important next step would be to sort of expand this into an explicit generative model like we did in the first chapter, something that can actually create games from scratch, hopefully in a way that is very human-like. So with that, we've covered all 6 of the projects. And just to wrap up, across various domains, we've shown that this programmatic lens and techniques from program synthesis allow us to generate new games and goals that are human-like and interesting, and also to better understand what makes these games and goals tick and how people think about them. And in large part, I think this is interesting because games are tiny windows into the world and also into the people who create and play them. So by understanding this process of game invention, we can better understand goal setting, creativity, exploration, and all the various cognitive processes they involve. And with that, that's my time. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful collaborators, my friends, my family, everyone who has made these past 5 years just wonderful and excellent. And I also will have to give a special shout out to my partner, Allie, and the cats that have kept me sane throughout these 5 years. Thank you so much.